In the meanwhile, it's more than a year ago that UI5 team, Andreas and Peter, announced a repository on GitHub where they provided the UI5 app, which was not just building UI5, but also with TypeScript. At that point, I started using TypeScript in UI5 in every new project. And today it's time to share my experience, the journey I did, and also the challenges that come with it. And for those challenges, I've been spamming those three guys. And yeah, I'm happy to have them and the honor to be here next to me, the one and only Andreas Kunz, who helped me a lot with UI5 Custom Controls and Libraries in TypeScript. Yeah, nobody else than Peter himself. I think in the meanwhile, everyone knows him. I've been asking a lot of questions, but today he will focus on one, and an important one, I hope, unless he does a dance or something. And then the inventor of VDI5, here himself, who I think helped a lot of people in the UI5 community with VDI5 and creating test scripts. I myself, I will just talk it together and share some insights from my side, which I hopefully will be valuable for you as well. Before I go into the problems and the challenges, I would start with the beginning. What is TypeScript? TypeScript, if you look it up on the internet, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript which comes with optional static types. What this basically means that it's just JavaScript but with types. And with this, it comes closer to Java, C#, and I always like to make the reference to ABAP. It also comes closer to ABAP. It has, like in ABAP, you have data elements, structures, table types. You have similar but more easier things like that now in TypeScript. And just to give you a simple example, the most simple that I could think of, in 2020, we would have like a variable where we put in a string. Later on in the code, imagine there is a lot of code in between. We put in a number like the year 2020. We switch it again, we use it for a Boolean now. And in the end, we put again in a string. If it works fine, it will be okay. But this might lead to unwanted behavior. So with TypeScript, if you make a string, and I put in the string just to clarify that it's TypeScript, but normally TypeScript, if as soon as you put in a string, it will know that it's a string. The next time you put in a value that's not a string, it will immediately give you a syntax error. If you put in a Boolean, again, if you put in back a string, it will be fine. And this is the perfect example of the difference between JavaScript and TypeScript. The one is untyped, the other one is typed, which gives you a way better developer experience. Now, TypeScript, it can actually run everywhere where JavaScript runs, because simply we convert and we compile TypeScript to JavaScript. So in the end, it's JavaScript, and everywhere JavaScript runs, TypeScript will then run as well. So it will run in any browser and on Node.js. One more thing about TypeScript, it's already out there for many years. We could even tell that it's proven technology, but only the framework needs to support it. And finally, a year ago, UI5 team made it possible. UI5 support for TypeScript, but please, Andreas and Peter, can you explain a bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. For UI5, that is a JavaScript framework. It's difficult for the TypeScript compiler to understand what are the APIs, what are the methods that exist in JavaScript, in UI5 objects, what are the types that are returned, what do you have to put in, and so on. So all the types of the UI5 APIs are just not known through TypeScript, like for any other JavaScript framework. And the way to solve this is to provide type definition files, so-called .d.ts files, which is like header files in C, I think, which just define all the types used by the UI5 APIs. And so using these additional files, which we now provide from UI5, the TypeScript compiler knows exactly what the APIs are in terms of types. So what objects need to go in, what comes out. And so it can also check the application code, whether it is using the UI5 APIs correctly. And we generate these type definitions from the UI5 API documentation, basically. So in the JS doc of the UI5 sources, there it's all described what the types are. And this JS doc we used to generate the API documentation in the demo kit that you have all often used, I guess. But we also now generate these TypeScript definitions out of those. And there's one special thing, we generated them in a special way that we urge you to use modern JavaScript. So we no longer support, when you're using TypeScript, no longer support globals like sub.m.button, which is anyway discouraged. But you should load these modules asynchronously, but in TypeScript, no longer with the sub UI require, but with using modern ES6 JavaScript module imports. So you write import something from something at the top of the files, and this is how we want you to write modern JavaScript in TypeScript UI5 applications. Also, class definitions use real JavaScript classes, not the UI5 some class .extend to create a subclass. And okay, this is now modern JavaScript. Still UI5 at runtime needs those UI5 constructs. So how do we get this done, Peter?
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. I think the one hand side, as Andreas explained, is really having these DTS files to have the code completion then properly running to get the information, what is expected, what is the API. The other hand side is that, yeah, for sure, there needs to be a transpilation step, because the UI5 runtime, which runs the things later on, it doesn't understand yet the these ES modules or the classes. And therefore, we are using a transpilation step, which after that, what Wouter explained, having TypeScript, converting just the TypeScript to modern JavaScript, will do then the rest and transpile the modern JavaScript back to the UI5 runtime syntax. What happens there? It's reading all these imports. It can handle the static imports and the dynamic imports, and translates them either into the SAP UI define or in the SAP UI require syntax if it's a dynamic import. And the other part, what happens is that for the classes syntax, it takes these classes, it reads them and converts them into the object extend syntax. And you may have remembered some of them, you asked already, this add namespace specific. So as UI5 module names are in this dot syntax, we also require some additional information for this transpilation step, and therefore we added some JS doc on top on that, which adds the rest of the metadata we need for this transpilation step. And finally, then this modern TypeScript development or modern typeless syntax is then converted into a classic UI5 runtime syntax, which works with a UI5 runtime out of the box today.
Thank you, Peter and Andreas. I would not have could have said it any better. But just to say it simple again, because of that, it's possible to use TypeScript for building UI5 apps. Why would you do this? Why would you use TypeScript? Some would say, I don't like TypeScript, I would prefer JavaScript, but it really comes with a better developer experience. It's not for the end user. It's not directly for the end user, but it's in the first place for us as a developer. It's first of all super cool, but it also improves you the syntaxes, the auto-completion. It gives you correct auto-completion, not just some functions that are available on every JavaScript object. It will, if you have, for example, in JavaScript, you access a controller, you only have the functions and the properties for that controller available. Nothing less, nothing more. You will not have any mistakes. If you make a typo, it's easy to make a typo in JavaScript. But with TypeScript, you will immediately detect it before you even run it in the browser to see there is a bug. You will also, because of this auto-completion, it's not needed to always check the APIs which functions are available. You have it directly in your IDE. And if you combine that, you will have less bugs, more stable code, and in the end user will be happy that there are no bugs in your application. So on the long term, it's also for the end user. So just give it a try, and yeah, you have to check for yourself if you like it or not, but at least give it a try. To get started, so that was some theoretical talking. Now to get started. Before we get started, I have to admit it's something personal, but it's easy to start with TypeScript. It's just like JavaScript, but with types. But as soon as you would like to do more complicated stuff, like converting an array to another type of array by using a map function, you do not only have to convert the data, but you also have to convert the types. And this might things make some more complicated. And therefore, it's always good to understand the more complicated concept of TypeScript. And therefore, I recommend to have this, to follow this course on Udemy. Just have a look, and it really helps you when developing a project. What else helped me to get started is this project I referred to from more than a year ago. it's this GitHub repository. And you have to, if you know the repository, you also have to switch the branch to find the one with TypeScript. And this is a basic but perfect example to get started. It contains everything from fetching data to validating data and sending, and do the bindings, everything to get started. Another one is from Peter, a blog post where he explains just the same like a minute ago, but then written down and with some steps how to get started. And last but not least, we have this homepage for UI5 and TypeScript. It's not yet in the official document. This is official, as I understood from Andreas, but it's not in the UI5.sap.com documentation. Here, normally you should find all your answers, and otherwise you can create make a question on GitHub. But to get started, it's also important to know about the tooling. And for tooling, starts with the IDE. Is someone still using Web IDE? And I know some of you are. I don't know if it will work in with TypeScript, but yeah, if it works, please let me know. I'm very curious. Now with TypeScript, you're able to use any IDE that supports TypeScript because of the TypeScript definition files. It's not related on the framework, it's related on TypeScript. And there are many IDEs that support TypeScript. My preference goes to Visual Studio Code, but sometimes because of policies and so on, it's not always possible to use it. So as an alternative, I often use Business Application Studio. The next step, if you start, you have your IDE, you want to get started, you create a project. Normally we have those templates in Web IDE. In the UI5 tooling and Fiori tooling, we have those generators. But there are not many, at least a year ago, there were not many for TypeScript. My first project, I started from a generator in JavaScript and converted every file because I was just too lazy to set up the master detail in TypeScript. But now we have, at least there was already one generator, a simple one with a view and controller. But if you want to have to create one app, a second one, and a third one, every time with the master and detail, after the third one, you don't want to implement the master detail again manually. So therefore, I work together with Peter to create a master detail template in TypeScript, which I will show you. So again, as many of the demos you already had, it starts with the Yeoman, and there we use Easy UI5. I know I need to update my generator. It's not mentioning it now, but okay. And here we have a lot of generators. And the ones for TypeScript start with TS. The first one is simple, a view with a controller. And the second one is a master detail, which contains a flexible column layout. You just provide a name for it, demo, and a namespace. I just will use the Northwind service as demo purpose. And some magic Peter put in, it automatically fetches the entities of that OData source. So I can simply select the entity which I would like to use for my binding of the master list. So I'm going to use products. I also need a key for the navigation. So it needs to be unique. I take the ID. Also already a name just for the binding purpose on the list. I take the name and a description as a second field. You can choose a framework. Can choose a version, the author, and a new folder. And this will install everything, not just the flexible column layout in TypeScript files, but also the TypeScript configuration files. It could happen with Yeoman that we do need to do the install again, but normally the install happens and it should be fine. It seems to be okay. So I will open the app. I have a lot of trials. So before I'm going to show you what the result is, but before I do, I need you to take care of this folder. We do not start from the web app folder, we start from a source folder. When we run the app, which I will do right away, it will generate this web app folder. That's the compiler that takes TypeScript and generates, oh, sorry for that. It's a compiler that compiles TypeScript to JavaScript and generates a web app. At the point that you don't like to use TypeScript anymore, you can just continue from this web app folder and nothing happened. So I take a DVD player and we have like a master detail generated. One more thing, if we go to debug files, although it's JavaScript, we can still debug in TypeScript. And that's because the generator also creates mapping files. Like here, for every controller, there's a map file. The original ones are TypeScript files, just to show you. Here we have the TypeScript configuration. It comes with the best practice and recommendations from SAP, which I normally do not change unless there are other company policies. And in the package, we have scripts to compile from TypeScript to JavaScript, and then still the build from your UI5 app as a web app to your deploy version in the dist folder. And that's what you see here, the build TypeScript, build UI5. So from there on, everything stays the same. It's just a layer on top of it. So yeah, as you saw, it works perfectly fine also with the UI5 tooling and the Fiori tooling, which are similar. And yeah, I had this funny image on Twitter, which I think was very well placed here. But this is how to get started and to create your project and get started. But if you need to create a project on a bigger scale, a bigger app for an end user, then this will, you can create a simple app and do everything in the view and the controller. But personally, I like to have everything structured so it's easy to maintain and implement separation by concern. So therefore, I did an exercise, and it was really painful, a thinking exercise on how to get started with TypeScript and get the most out of TypeScript in UI5. And I wanted not to start from how I did it before and just in JavaScript. I wanted to start from scratch. But doing so, I realized that actually the way I did before, which I presented, I think, a few years ago, was actually an extra value on top of the way I worked before, now in TypeScript. So together with the four of us, we made a demo application, which we probably have over-engineered. I think that's the least you can tell, but I'm going to show you how it looks before explaining what we did. It's a very simple app for making a to-do list, which contains the way I work in apps with TypeScript. There is a custom library, a custom control in TypeScript, with the UI5 implementation. Everything is there, all connected in one simple app. It takes a while, but it will be there in this. Oh, voila. So it's a simple to-do app. We have two items. I can add a new one. Hello. Then I have a new one. I can edit this one. Say UI5con changes immediately. I can say, yeah, it's done. And you see the graph. This is a custom control, which is updated immediately. And I can delete it again. But before I explain what I did with the UI, I want to invite Peter again to explain a bit on the setup, because it's, for me, it was the first time I did it like this, but yeah.
Yeah, from a setup perspective, we decided to go for a mono repository here. A mono repository because Wouter said it already, it's about separation of concerns. And what we wanted to do is, as we have on the server side, we are running with a CAP server here. And we have a UI project, this sample project, what you have seen here, this to-do application. And then there is a library which brings in this chart. So, and the idea was really to separate all these pieces into 3 different NPM packages that they could be built and developed separately, released independently, and then consumed together. And while Wouter was playing around with that, he did a lot of hacks. So how to put the things together, because it's not very well documented. That's why we said it's maybe best to explain it, but I think I can also show that right part in the code in a second. So the idea is really that we use a monorepo tool. We are at the moment, my favorite at the moment is using PNPM. It's very efficient, what it means about the management, about the different projects and how it's connecting that, using symlinking rather than copying dependencies or doing stuff like that. And together with this PNPM, then I put each each npm package into the subfolder structure here inside. The server is built with classic JavaScript. The UI project is using TypeScript, and the library project is also using TypeScript. So maybe let's look a bit into the code, because this really shows it how the things are connected to each other. And here, when we go now a little bit up and collapse the whole stuff, we see again this structure. We have packages, we have the server here. This is the cup server part. And there is not anything in the app, because personally, I would say mixing the applications inside the server in the app folder is a bit the wrong direction, because you should clearly separate the dependencies of a UI project and a server project. And that's why we decided to go another way. So the server is started just in the background. And then the UI project is using a proxy to consume the data from the server. That's how you would do that then that way. And this UI project is also this project, which is then the main part which is running. And in order to consume the library project, we also didn't want to do some tricking with referring to some folder. We really said it needs to be a real dependency. So what we did is, and this is possible for all custom libraries with the UI5 tooling, that you specify here a dependency to your library. Also in the case of the mono repo, this works. And then you need to list it in the UI5 dependency section. So to tell the UI5 tooling that this dependency should be also looked up and considered when starting up. And then if this local library project has the name, for sure, this needs to be the name of the library. You see that here in the package JSON of the library. This is here also named like this. So that's the way how it resolves. And this project for the UI5 tooling needs to have the UI5 YAML, which contains all the relevant information where the source is in and the test is in. And basically that's it, what we also set up here in this thing, also as a kind of a best practice, how a project structure can look like, where you really separate your individual pieces, the server, the library projects, custom modules, whatever, and then finally the UI project, and then bring it together. And with that.
Thank you, Peter. You really made a statement on the CAP structure.
Yeah, it's my favorite structure that way.
All right. So go back, I focus really on the UI. Like I said, I like to have it structured and divided into different layers. So I divide it again in a service layer where I use also generic types. On top of it, actually an internal data model of the API, and then the view and the controller. The view and the controller will only take care of the UI handling. The to-do model and the classes, there I use classes of TypeScript, that will handle everything related to the internal data model. Everything like you normally do with a JSON model will be handled in this class and in the separated classes. And the service will only handle the communication to your backend system. But let me show it in the code. So for the UI, we go to the I have a base service, and I had it before with not using TypeScript, and I use it again, but now I improved it by using generic types. And with generic types, this allows me to create my request like OData. I say the entity, I want to do a GET request, and the result will be of the type to do entity set. To do entity set, I define it on the top of my service class, object class. I say it will give me an array back of the type to do entity. And this should be a one-to-one mapping with your OData entity. On top of that, I have the to-do model. Normally, I also would make this a wrapper of the JSON model, but it was an idea of Volker and Peter to extend from the JSON model. And here, then I can just call the parent and say, these are all the properties I would like to have in my view for binding purpose. We also made it observable by implementing mobx. So here at the top, we implemented mobx as an external library. And then I'm not going to go into too much details, but I will focus on the most important one, that's the read function. Here I use the to-do service to get all to-dos. And what I do then is I go over all the to-do items, and I convert them to instances of the class ToDoItem. And why do I do that? In the class, I can then implement functions that are dedicated to my ToDoItem. For example, the getJSON function, normally you would not generate an ID on the UI, but here we just made it as an example. So you can really have functions and logic in your object. Now, if you look at the controller, here, if you, for example, check mark a ToDoItem, then for that line, based on the binding context, I get a full object, and this will be an instance of a ToDoItem, which I forward to my ToDo model and to the update function. In the update function, I have then the full object, the instance of the class, where I just can call the getJSON function, call my updates function in the service layer, and it's done. I have limited lines of code in my model, limited amounts in my service, and in my controller, it's purely handling the UI. By that, I implemented separation by concern, and I have different layers. At least that's the way I prefer to do things. I also put in some reusable code, like the mapper, which I always showed, but also for dialogues opening. I always like to have a dialogue with its own controller and not just the same main controller. As an example, in the controller, I use here open fragment. I say the name of my dialogue. I can even pass some data to it. And by using promises, the dialogue can send something back. And I said it has its own controller. So it has a fragment and a controller. And in the controller, I have like an on before show. So every time the dialogue is being opened, you can do some initialization again. And in the onClose, I can send something back using the resolve. I did this example in the right upper corner. So I send some data, this is UI5con, close it, and it sends something back. Just as an example, might be interesting for you as well. But to come back on my challenges, it was not always super easy. So I had some challenges, like the limited generators. So the first time I really started from a JavaScript template and converted to TypeScript. In the meanwhile, we have 2 more. I guess there will be more as well. But if you have another template, a generator, or any ID, please feel free. You can look at our template and start your own. There is official documentation, but not on the place that we are used to. So that was also in the very beginning hard to find. Sometimes it can happen that there are still missing types, and that's because it's still growing and evolving. But this also leads, if you're on a UI5 version 1.71, for example, you can use TypeScript. But TypeScript's definition files are generated on the latest version. So if you use the type definition files of the latest version and you're on 1.71, if you use a function that might have changed in between, there might be a conflict where you need to be aware of. And then one of the important points I was struggling with is UI5 Custom, UI5 Libraries and Controls, where Andreas helped me a lot. So if you can explain it one more time, Andreas.
If you show me an application where you use controls, then I can certainly show you that.
Here you go.
Here you go. Okay. So that's the app you have just seen that they have described before. We have this UI part we've been talking about the last couple of minutes, and this library part where we have a custom control library written in TypeScript. And if we go in there into the sample lib folder and open the custom chart TS file, which is the main custom control in this library, then it looks pretty much like regular UI5 controls. I mean, that's the ES6 module imports instead of sub-UI define that we have talked about in the beginning, and the modern way of creating classes. But that's not related to TypeScript, that's just modern JavaScript. And if you go further down, well, we have the on after rendering method you might know. So you know, I guess. I mean, how many of you have created their custom control or know at least in theory how it works? Yeah, that's at least half of you. And who has not? This should be the other half.
And who
Okay.
did it in TypeScript already?
Some who have been in our workshop.
Not bad.
And some more. Yeah, but basically the code basically looks actually just the same as in plain JavaScript. So what exactly is the challenge? What is the problem? I'll show you. The problem is, if I delete this file, the problem is this: lots of error messages here that TypeScript complains chart.getRecords. Oh,
yeah,
clever.
The generator runs.
Yeah. Okay, let's try it again.
Like
it was already the solution.
Andreas,
So, but
it's
let's
like
show
a
the
hamster on a
problem
wheel.
first.
You cannot delete it.
I could delete very fast, but I couldn't talk that fast. So, okay, get records does not exist on type custom chart. So we have developed the custom chart control here. We have said it has an aggregation records, but still TypeScript says, I don't know the method get records. So why is it this? Why does this problem exist? And the problem is that these methods, these accessor methods for aggregations, for properties and so on, are generated by UI5 at runtime. So they are not written here in the code, so TypeScript cannot know about them. And solution for this problem is that we have provided a tool, which you have already seen in action now, which basically just generates those missing methods into a certain type definition file that is sort of merged with the control you are implementing. So TypeScript knows all these methods that will exist at runtime. So we can see it in the package JSON. It's already referenced and it has been started already. It's the watch controls task. And I know the H is missing. This tool, no, it looks a bit strange. But this tool is basically just scanning the project, looking for controls and other managed objects, looking at the metadata. And, oh, no, yeah, I need to go see packages and library. Now the same thing again. So it just looks for all the metadata of controls and generates those methods. So it will need to scan the program, of course, all the files and also actually UI5. And then it generates files like this custom chart gen.ts file, which defines all this get type, set type, and for the records, many more methods that will exist at runtime. And so TypeScript is aware of these methods and can make you work with those methods. It knows what is returned, what is the input that is required, and so on. And for the constructors, for the settings object, there's something similar done. And with this tool, I would say we can develop UI5 controls in TypeScript.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. So the next problem was how to integrate this now in my app. But I think Peter already mentioned it. But still, I face some problems by integrating third-party libraries.
Yeah, so integrating third-party libraries was also one part of the demo what we had in the keynote. So it's really about how to make it as easy as possible and as close as possible to more or less standard that you can integrate then a third-party library into your project. And on the one hand side, we have it for this custom chart library that we want to use something like chart.js. So it's the way how you import that. It's also suggested on their webpage. If you want to use chart.js, then you write an import like this import chart from chart.js/auto. It's a submodule in a chart.js package. Or on the other hand side, what we have seen in the application, the UI application, is that we want to or did use MobX. It was in the models layer in this to-do item model. And here we also consume it directly as suggested from the web page, because this brings two advantages with that. I don't need to take care about code completion because it's just handled like handling any other open source or any other NPM package. It's just the way how it's done. And in the past, when you consumed it from or want to consume a third-party library in UI5 via the UI5 tooling, you had to write the shimming configuration. And this was really somehow ugly. And then later on, you had to also write then the namespace because it was then in your project in like // or // third party and then MobX and something like that. And you didn't get code completion for that. And then we decided really to do it with the help of an extension for the tooling, the UI5 tooling modules middleware. And with the help of the UI5 tooling modules middleware, which is present then in this project, you can then consume directly from the runtime here, these dependencies. And yeah, maybe you can help me to start. It's a Belgium keyboard. Just run the application once again, and we can briefly show that, how that looks like. Is it npm start or is it pm start?
npm start uses pnpm. Yeah.
Okay, good. So it's back again, because what now happens is with these third-party resources like this MobX, as it's written as import MobX, what happens then in the transpilation step? And this can be also used not only for the TypeScript world, then it's being converted. I don't want to do anything here, cancel. Then it's being converted into sub-UI define MobX. So it will be resolved then from a loading like resources MobX. And that's what I want to show to you. What happens now? Resources / MobX.js.
Wait, let me help.
No, it's okay. I just need to find a way on your and the different. I didn't test it up front. It's the usual thing. MobX.js. And now if we increase it a little bit, Control+, help. Then you see what happens exactly. And what happens here is that it becomes a SAP UI define, a UI5 AMD-like module. And that's why it works out of the box. So this UI5 tooling modules middleware bridges the gap that it's a configuration-free third-party library then, which you can consume in your application. And besides the middleware, there is also a task available, which converts it then later on for your project in a dist folder and puts it there in the resources. Then a mobx.js is available in the same format and it's configuration-free to use. And that's it. With that, you can consume most of the client-side third-party dependencies.
Thank you, Peter. And then one last thing, something we often forget about, that's testing. Volker, the last minutes are all yours.
So
with
the testing part, VDI5 also has a TypeScript enablement. For those of you who do not know how VDI5 works, it's an extension to WebDriver IO, and it interfaces with the record replay API in the browser scope, but runs in Node.js scope. So if you then look at the folder structure here, once again, you're in packages UI test. And that is also the standard location in the TypeScript world for test files. And in there's an example.e2e.ts. And if you look at the test file itself, briefly or quickly and easily going through the test file here, it describes the basic usage here. We get ourselves an input control, which, by the way, is a web component, a UI5 web component, and we simply assert that it's visible. And then for adding a to-do item, we grab ourselves the before or the list itself. And you can see here the cast is to a sub-m list at development time. And by casting that, you get auto-completion out of the box like so. And that's also specific to VDI5. You have all the UI5 API methods available on controls that you usually have in the browser scope, now also in the Node.js scope. So we get ourselves the items, then we have a text, Peter rules, that we insert as a new to-do item. And before I here walk you over every single thing, I'm just going to show you how that looks like. Because there's another specific about VDI5 TypeScript. It does not generate, as UI5 does, any runtime artifacts. It transpiles the TypeScript code on the fly and then runs it in the browser. So VDI5 starts, the browser opens, the application starts up. We add ourselves a to-do item once the application comes up. Title of the to-do item is Peter rules, and then the test displays its results once it's done, and you see what happened. Now, also at the same time, VDI5 is capable of debugging inside the test itself. So you do not have to go into the browser and do anything. You can stay in the code here. And you can set a breakpoint just anywhere, like so, for example. Then I restart the test. And the VDI5 runtime is going to halt at that exact point. And even more so, For those of you who are knowledgeable in the ABAP world, the ABAP debugger has the capability of injecting variables at runtime and changing values. And you can do the same here. At the left side, you see the current state of the variables. So, of course, PETA rules, but also Wouter rules. And if I now continue that test and switch back to the browser, you see that actually Wouter rules as well. And that enables you also from a development perspective and easy debugging of your tests during test execution.
Thank you very much for the awesome presentation. And now it's time for the questions. Do we have already questions in the audience? Oh, yeah, quite some. Let's go first for a question in the audience.
Thanks for the great presentation. I have one question, Wouter. Are you aware of a tool that generates OData or that converts OData metadata into TypeScript interfaces?
I think, Peter, you for the generator, you showed me something similar.
There was something, I don't remember it now out of the box.
No, but
Or can we?
Yeah, there was a project which does that.
Okay. Or would it be possible that we use this TypeScript interface generator for the UI controls and feed it with OData metadata and creating interfaces for entities? That's really something I miss when doing TypeScript development.
We can make it part of the generator.
We can create a generator for that, yeah.
And we could also make it part of the TypeScript generator.
I think from a separation, I would keep, let's say, the controls independent from this model parts, but why not?
Okay, thanks.
Nice. Then next up, we have also several questions from the online audience. And I think two questions I saw regarding Fiori elements and Fiori tools. So can you use TypeScript also with Fiori elements application?
Yeah, a good question. I have the same question.
I think we have some product owners from Fiori elements in the audience.
At least for the Fiori elements APIs, we generate the type definitions. That's at least one part of it.
I think there are a few specifics when it comes regarding the extensibility part, everything which is more going in the direction of being generic. Then there needs to be some magic or some generation part which provides the types for that. Or we have a more generic API, a TypeScript API for that available. I think it depends on the use case. The basic things would work. Most of the things are nevertheless declarative in a way. And when it comes to API consumption, it depends on the kind of API.
By the way, for the test time, you can use the so-called OData v4 test library for testing Fiori elements apps. That's integrated in VDI5. That's more or less the copy of paste of the code that you know from OPA5 already. So that's the same, they're one-on-one compatible. And those you can also write in TypeScript. So we're ahead of the game here.
Cool, good to know. Okay, so the answer, short answer, it depends. But testing is possible. Good, then I think I saw another question from the audience, right? Or is that already solved? It is solved, perfect. Then we can go ahead with
that would be the next community project now, right?
Next UI5con.
Yeah, definitely.
Good. Then another question from the online audience. So directly to Wouter, what are the drawbacks of using TypeScript? I know you told me that documentation was lacking. Is that improved already?
That's improved a lot. I showed the homepage. In the beginning, there was no homepage, but it grew over the year. And now, basically, most of the questions that you have, they are answered there. I think with this demo project, that's what I think we forgot about. We will publish it. And
it's published.
It's published.
Volker did it just right before.
And this one will help also a lot, I think, as an example app.
Yeah, nice. I have to add that over the time, we have also added sample applications, sample control library, and so on. So all from this documentation page, or they are linked from there. Lots of samples that have been created since you started using TypeScript.
Nice, good to know. Then next question, which UI5 version is actually 100% compatible with TypeScript?
The latest, no?
No, 100%, there is no 100%, right? as much as possible.
I think the gaps are described on this documentation page when you look for beta state. Basically, it is 100% compatible. There are things where the UI5 documentation is not perfect, but the documentation is just wrong in some cases or not as precise as it should be. And this reflects now in the TypeScript type definitions. And these are many single places where we need to improve, but that we are not even aware of. So try it, open tickets, and then those single things will be fixed. But there are also ways described in the documentation how you can overcome temporarily such an issue. So there's nothing that keeps you blocking from using TypeScript.
And for VDI5, I have to add, we're behind there in the game. We're still struggling with the TypeScript types because of the runtime artifact generation. So when you locate a control and the framework is supposed to know that, for example, it's a web C button, and that's very difficult to achieve at development time. So there's still a gap there. There's a lot of casting that you'll see in the code. It looks ugly, but you know, we still need to take it one step at a time.
Nice. Okay. Is there, meanwhile, we have, I think, time for one more question from the audience, if there is. Good, looks good, because there is one final question then from the online tool. It's a little bit of a longer one. So are there any plans to support the UI5 tooling modules with on-premise SAP Fiori Launchpads as well? Because there's no middleware in between and the path won't be resolved correctly. And if yes, when will it be available?
There is a draft available for that already, which does exactly cover this thing. So there was a colleague also from SAP reaching out to me saying and asking exactly for how to make it possible to run such an open source or use this open source also in the FLP. And the idea behind that is that the tooling modules middleware is then reading or looking up the dependencies, the third-party dependencies, and then putting these third-party dependencies in the namespace of the application. So it's like a local third party then. And with that, you can deploy it then also in the FLP on-premise world. And you can, then it's loaded per library. And this is the next thing, just a few weeks away from being available. Depends on how much time we have in the free time. And then you can also include third party locally for your application and deploy it into the FLP. It also allows them to have per application different versions when the library is not having global exposures.
All right, awesome. That's all the time we have for questions. So thanks a lot again for the presentation. Let's give them a big round of applause.